The whispers started the moment Adelaide Parker stepped off the dusty stagecoach in Winnetka, California, her threadbare traveling dress doing nothing to hide the fact that she had arrived in this gold rush town with exactly $3 to her name and not a single possession of value beyond the worn leather satchel clutched in her trembling hands. It was the spring of 1852, and Winnetka had become a bustling settlement where fortunes were made and lost with the turn of a card or the swing of a pickaxe. Adelaide had traveled from Missouri after her father's death left her with nothing but debts, and the burning knowledge that her uncle planned to marry her off to a 60-year-old merchant in exchange for the cancellation of those very debts. She had fled in the night with what little money she could scrape together, buying passage west with the wild hope that California might offer her something her old life never could: freedom. The stagecoach driver hefted her single bag down with a grunt, eyeing her with the practiced assessment of a man who had seen countless desperate souls arrive in this town. Adelaide smoothed her dark auburn hair, trying to tame the wild curls that had escaped during the bone-rattling journey. Her green eyes scanned the main street, taking in the false-fronted buildings, the muddy thoroughfare churned up by wagon wheels and horses, and the sideways glances of the townspeople who had already begun their evaluation of this new arrival. She was 22 years old, reasonably pretty despite the exhaustion that shadowed her features, and utterly alone in a town where women were scarce and heavily scrutinized. Within an hour of checking into the only boarding house that would accept a woman traveling alone, Adelaide learned the harsh reality of her situation. The landlady, Mrs. Cassidy, a sharp-featured woman with calculating eyes, laid out the facts with brutal efficiency. "You will need employment, Miss Parker. The room is $2 a week, meals extra. I run a respectable establishment, so no entertaining of gentlemen in your quarters." Mrs. Cassidy's gaze swept over Adelaide's worn dress and scuffed boots. "There is work at the laundry, though the pay is poor. Or you might consider what most sensible young women in your position consider: marriage. There are many men here seeking wives." Adelaide had swallowed hard, her pride stinging. "I will find work, Mrs. Cassidy, thank you." But finding work proved more complicated than she had anticipated. The laundry was already staffed. The general store had no need for help. The restaurant owner took one look at her and shook his head, saying he needed someone with experience. By the third day, Adelaide's $3 had dwindled to mere coins, and desperation began to claw at her throat. It was on that third evening, as she sat in the boarding-house parlor trying to mend a tear in her only other dress, that she overheard the conversation that would change everything. Two women sat near the window, their voices carrying in the quiet room. One was Mrs. Cassidy herself, and the other was a visiting matron from a nearby settlement. "That Parker girl," Mrs. Cassidy said, her tone dripping with practiced sympathy that barely concealed her disdain. "She is in quite a predicament. No family, no prospects, no dowry to speak of. I have had 3 different men inquire about her, thinking she might be marriageable, but when they learn she has nothing to offer, not even a decent wardrobe, they lose interest quickly enough." "Shame," the other woman clucked. "Pretty girl like that, but what man wants a wife who brings nothing to the marriage? These are practical times. A man needs a woman who can contribute something beyond a fair face. Indeed, she has got no dowry to offer, no connections, no skills that I can determine. I give her another week before she is forced to accept whatever proposal comes her way, regardless of the man's character. Desperation makes fools of us all." Adelaide's hand stilled on her mending, her face burning with humiliation and anger. She kept her eyes down, pretending she had not heard, but every word had landed like a physical blow. She had known her situation was dire, but hearing it dissected so coldly made it unbearably real. That night, lying in her narrow bed, Adelaide made a decision. She would not wait to become so desperate that she would accept marriage to just anyone. She would find work, any work, even if it meant leaving Winnetka to search in the surrounding areas. She had fled one unwanted marriage. She would not walk willingly into another. The next morning, she rose before dawn and dressed in her sturdiest clothes. She packed what little food she could afford into her satchel and set out on foot, heading toward the foothills where she had heard there were scattered homesteads and mining camps that might need help. It was a risk, traveling alone, but staying in town felt like waiting for a trap to spring shut. The California sun climbed higher as she walked, the road giving way to rougher trails that wound through oak trees and scattered pines. She passed a few travelers who eyed her curiously but said nothing. By midday, her feet ached and her throat was parched, but she pressed on, driven by stubborn determination. She was following a narrow creek, thinking she might refill her water flask, when she heard the sound of an axe striking wood. The rhythmic thwack echoed through the trees, and Adelaide hesitated, weighing her options. Approaching a stranger's camp alone was dangerous, but she was lost and tired, and the afternoon was wearing on. Drawing a deep breath, she moved toward the sound. The clearing opened before her like something from a storybook, though far rougher around the edges. A sturdy log cabin sat nestled against the hillside, smoke curling from its stone chimney. Split wood was stacked in neat cords along one side, and a vegetable garden showed the first tender shoots of spring growth. But it was the man wielding the axe who made Adelaide stop in her tracks. He was enormous, easily over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they seemed to block out the sun. His long dark hair was tied back with a leather cord, though strands had escaped to frame a face that was all hard angles and weathered tan skin. He wore only a leather vest over his bare torso despite the cool mountain air, and every swing of the axe revealed muscles that rippled with raw power. His arms were like hewn timber themselves, and his hands dwarfed the axe handle. He must have sensed her presence because he stopped mid-swing, turning with the fluid grace of a predator to face her. His eyes were a startling blue-gray, like storm clouds, and they fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Adelaide was acutely aware of how she must look, dusty, disheveled, a lone woman appearing out of nowhere at a bachelor's homestead. She lifted her chin, refusing to show fear even as her heart hammered against her ribs. "I apologize for the intrusion," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I am looking for work and seem to have gotten turned around on the trails. I heard your axe and thought I might ask for directions back to Winnetka." The man set the axe down, leaning it against the chopping block. He wiped his hands on his worn trousers, studying her with those unsettling eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice was deep and rough like gravel underfoot. "You walked up here from town alone?" "Yes." "That was foolish." Adelaide's spine stiffened. Perhaps, but necessary nonetheless. Something that might have been amusement flickered across his weathered face. He reached for a shirt that was draped over a nearby fence post and shrugged into it, though he did not bother with the buttons. "Xavier Harding," he said. "This is my land. Adelaide Parker. You said you are looking for work, Miss Parker?" "Yes, any honest work. I can cook, clean, mend, tend gardens. I am a hard worker and a quick learner." Xavier crossed his arms over his chest, the fabric of his shirt straining against his muscles. "What brings a woman alone to California, looking for work in the hills?" Adelaide met his gaze squarely. She was tired of evasion, tired of pretense. I am running from an unwanted marriage and trying to make my own way. I have no family, no money, and according to the fine ladies of Winnetka, no prospects whatsoever. But I would rather work myself to the bone than marry a stranger for security." The words hung in the air between them. Xavier's expression was unreadable, but something shifted in his eyes. He glanced at the sky, gauging the sun's position, then looked back at her. "It will be dark in a few hours. The trail back to town is easy to miss if you do not know it well, and there are mountain lions in these hills. You can stay the night in the barn, and I will take you back to town in the morning." "I do not need charity, Mr. Harding. It is not charity, it is practical sense. A woman alone on these trails after dark is asking for trouble, and I would not have that on my conscience." He gestured toward the cabin. "I have stew on the fire. You look half-starved. Eat something, rest, and we will sort out the rest in the morning." Adelaide wanted to refuse out of sheer stubbornness, but her empty stomach betrayed her with an audible growl. Xavier's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile, and she felt her cheeks heat with embarrassment. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I accept." The inside of Xavier's cabin was sparse but surprisingly clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a black pot hanging over the flames releasing the savory smell of cooking meat and vegetables. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs sat in the center of the room, and a large bed occupied one corner, covered with thick furs. Shelves held basic supplies, and a rifle rested above the door. It was the home of a man who lived alone and liked it that way. Xavier ladled stew into 2 wooden bowls and set them on the table, gesturing for Adelaide to sit. She did, suddenly aware of how hungry she was. The stew was simple but delicious, rich with venison, potatoes, and wild herbs. She ate with as much decorum as her hunger would allow, conscious of Xavier's eyes on her. "How long have you been in Winnetka?" he asked, breaking the silence. "4 days. And already you are tramping through the hills looking for work." "The town offered me nothing but judgment and pity. I thought I might have better luck elsewhere." Xavier grunted, tearing off a piece of bread from a loaf on the table. "Town folks can be hard on outsiders, especially women on their own. What did you do back where you came from?" "I kept house for my father after my mother died. He was a clerk, and we lived simply. When he passed, his debts fell to me, and my uncle decided the best solution was to marry me off to one of his business associates, a man old enough to be my grandfather, with 2 previous wives already in the ground." "So you ran?" "I ran," Adelaide confirmed, meeting his gaze. "And I do not regret it, even if my circumstances are difficult now." Xavier studied her for a long moment, and Adelaide had the distinct impression he was seeing far more than she intended to reveal. Finally, he nodded, as if coming to some internal decision. "I could use help around here," he said abruptly. "The garden needs tending, and I am a poor hand at mending and such. Cooking for one is hardly worth the effort most days. If you are serious about wanting work, I will hire you. Room and board, plus wages. Nothing improper. You would have your own space in the barn until I can build a proper addition to the cabin." Adelaide's heart leaped, but caution tempered her excitement. "Why would you offer this to a stranger?" "Because you have got courage enough to walk into the hills alone looking for a chance, and I respect that. Because I know what it is like to be judged by circumstances beyond your control." His expression was hard to read. "And because I can see you are desperate, and desperation makes people vulnerable. Better you work for someone who will treat you fairly than end up in a situation you cannot escape." The kindness beneath his gruff words nearly undid her. Adelaide blinked back the sudden sting of tears, refusing to let them fall. "I will earn my keep, Mr. Harding. You will not regret this." "Xavier," he corrected. If you are going to be working here, we can dispense with formalities." "Xavier," she repeated, and the name felt strange and intimate on her tongue. "And I am Adelaide." "Adelaide," he said, and somehow the way he said it in that deep rumbling voice made it sound like a different name entirely. That night, Adelaide slept in the barn as Xavier had suggested, though he had made it as comfortable as possible with clean hay and heavy blankets. She lay awake for a long time, staring at the rafters and trying to process the rapid turn her life had taken. This morning she had been on the verge of complete destitution. Now she had work, shelter, and the promise of a fresh start, and she had Xavier Harding, the mysterious mountain man who had taken her in without judgment or expectation. She did not know what to make of him yet. He was intimidating in his size and strength, but there had been no threat in his manner, only a rough courtesy. He was unlike any man she had ever known, and something about him made her feel both nervous and oddly safe. As sleep finally claimed her, her last thought was that perhaps, just perhaps, her gamble on California might pay off after all. The first week at Xavier's homestead passed in a blur of activity. Adelaide threw herself into her new duties with fierce determination, desperate to prove her worth. She woke before dawn to start the fire and prepare breakfast, feeding the chickens Xavier kept and gathering eggs. She tended the garden, pulling weeds and coaxing the young plants along. She scrubbed clothes in the creek and hung them to dry on lines strung between the trees. She mended Xavier's worn shirts and patched his trousers, her needle flying through the fabric in the evening light. Xavier, for his part, kept to his own work. He spent his days chopping wood, hunting in the surrounding forest, and working on various improvements to his property. He was building a small addition to the cabin, true to his word, and Adelaide watched in fascination as the structure took shape under his skilled hands. He worked with the easy confidence of a man who had built his entire life with those hands, and there was something almost mesmerizing about watching him move, lifting heavy logs as if they weighed nothing, his muscles flexing and straining. They fell into an easy routine, sharing meals and occasional conversation but respecting each other's space. Xavier was not much for small talk, Adelaide discovered, but when he did speak, his words carried weight. He told her about the land, pointing out which plants were edible and which were poisonous, showing her how to read the weather in the clouds and the behavior of animals. He spoke little of his own past, and Adelaide did not press, understanding that they both had histories they preferred to leave unexamined. But despite the comfortable rhythm of their days, Adelaide was acutely aware of Xavier in ways that both confused and disturbed her. She noticed the way his hair caught the sunlight, turning dark brown to bronze. She noticed the way his hands, so large and rough, could be surprisingly gentle when handling a bird's egg or adjusting a delicate plant. She noticed the rare occasions when he smiled, a brief flash of warmth that transformed his stern features entirely. She told herself it was simply gratitude, that anyone would feel warmly toward a person who had offered help when it was desperately needed. But late at night, lying in her space in the barn that was gradually becoming a proper small room as Xavier added walls and a door, she had to admit the truth. She was drawn to Xavier Harding in a way that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with the way her heart quickened when he was near. It was dangerous, this feeling. Xavier had offered her employment, nothing more. She had no reason to believe he saw her as anything other than a worker, someone to help make his solitary life a bit easier. The last thing she needed was to develop feelings for a man who had shown her only practical kindness. But the heart, she was learning, did not much care for practical considerations. The shift between them came on a warm afternoon in late May. Adelaide was working in the garden, her sleeves rolled up and her skirts kilted high to keep them out of the dirt. She was so focused on her task that she did not hear Xavier approach until his shadow fell across her. "You have done good work here," he said, surveying the neat rows of vegetables. "The garden has never looked better." Adelaide sat back on her heels, shading her eyes to look up at him. "It is satisfying work. I like seeing things grow." Xavier crouched down beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. He reached out and gently lifted one of the tomato plants, examining it with surprising care. "My mother had a garden like this," he said quietly. "She could make anything grow, even in the worst soil. She said plants responded to attention like people." It was the first time he had mentioned his family, and Adelaide held very still, afraid that any movement might break the spell and make him retreat back into silence. "She sounds like a wise woman," Adelaide ventured. "She was. She died when I was 16. Fever took her in a matter of days." Xavier released the plant and stood brushing dirt from his hands. "My father followed her within the year. Broken heart, the doctor said, though officially it was pneumonia." "I am sorry," Adelaide said softly. "Losing both of them so close together must have been devastating." "It was. I drifted for a while after that. Worked on riverboats, tried my hand at trapping, even joined a wagon train west as a guard. Nothing felt right until I found this place. Built the cabin with my own hands, claimed the land, made it mine. It is the first place I have felt at home since my parents died." Adelaide understood that feeling more than she could say. "I know what you mean. I felt that way back in Missouri, like I was living someone else's life, just going through the motions. Coming here, working with my hands, having control over my own days, it is the first time I have felt like myself." Xavier looked down at her, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "You have made this place feel different," he said. "More alive." "I had forgotten what it was like to have someone to share meals with, to hear another voice. I did not realize how quiet it had gotten until you arrived." "I hope that is a good thing," Adelaide said, her pulse quickening. "It is," Xavier said simply. Then, as if embarrassed by his own candor, he cleared his throat and straightened. "I am going hunting this afternoon. We need more meat. Will you be all right here on your own?" "Of course. I will have supper ready when you return." He nodded and strode away toward the cabin to get his rifle, leaving Adelaide kneeling in the garden with her heart racing and her mind whirling. There had been something in his eyes, in his voice, that spoke of more than employer to employee. Or was she simply seeing what she wanted to see, projecting her own growing feelings onto him? She forced herself to return to her work, but concentration eluded her. Her thoughts kept circling back to Xavier, to the way he had looked at her, to the rough tenderness in his voice when he spoke of his mother. She was falling for him, she realized, with a mixture of excitement and terror. Falling hard and fast for a mountain man who had shown her kindness when no one else would. The question was, did he feel anything for her in return? That evening, when Xavier returned with a deer slung over his shoulders like it weighed nothing at all, Adelaide had supper waiting. She had made biscuits and gravy, using the last of the flour, and had picked wild greens to go alongside. It was simple food, but she had taken care with it, wanting it to be good. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, but Adelaide could not shake the feeling that something had shifted between them that afternoon. The air felt charged, heavy with unspoken things. "Adelaide," Xavier said suddenly, setting down his fork, "I need to know something." Her heart jumped. "Yes, are you happy here, truly? Because if this is not what you want, if you would rather be back in town looking for other opportunities, I will understand." The question caught her off guard. "Do you want me to leave?" No, Xavier said immediately, his voice almost fierce. No, that is not what I am saying at all. I need to know that you are staying because you want to, not because you feel you have no other choice. Adelaide set down her own fork, her hands trembling slightly. I am staying because I want to, she said carefully. I am happier here than I have been in years, Xavier. This work, this place, it feels right, and you. She trailed off, unsure how to finish that sentence without revealing too much. And me, Xavier prompted, his storm-colored eyes fixed on her face. Adelaide took a deep breath, summoning her courage. And you have been kinder to me than anyone has in a very long time. You took me in when I had nothing, when the whole town had already written me off. You treated me with respect and dignity. I will not forget that. Xavier was quiet for a long moment, his expression difficult to read in the firelight. Then he pushed back from the table and stood, pacing to the window. He stood with his back to her, his shoulders tense. The things people were saying in town, he said finally. About you having no dowry, no prospects. I heard some of that before I found you on my land. Adelaide's stomach dropped. You were in town. The day before you came up the mountain. I was at the general store and I overheard some women talking. They mentioned a young woman who had arrived alone, said she had nothing to offer, that she would end up taking the first proposal that came along out of desperation. He turned to face her. When you appeared in my clearing the next day, I knew it was you they had been talking about. Then you took me in out of pity, Adelaide said, her voice flat. The warmth that had been building between them suddenly felt cold and hollow. No, Xavier said sharply. I took you in because those women were wrong, dead wrong. When you stood there in my clearing, dusty and tired but still holding your head high, still ready to fight for yourself, I saw strength. I saw courage. I saw a woman who refused to let circumstances break her. He crossed back to the table, bracing his hands on it and leaning toward her. You said you have got nothing to offer. They said you have got no dowry. That is the stupidest thing I have ever heard. You have got yourself, Adelaide. Your spirit, your determination, your kindness. That is worth more than any dowry could ever be. Adelaide stared at him, her eyes burning with unshed tears. You cannot mean that. I mean every word. Xavier's voice was rough with emotion. You came here with nothing and turned this place into a home. You work harder than any hired hand I could have found. You made me remember what it is like to care about something beyond simple survival. You think that is nothing. You think that has no value. I think most men would disagree with you, Adelaide whispered. Then most men are fools. Xavier reached across the table and took her hand in his, engulfing her smaller fingers completely. His touch was warm and calloused, and Adelaide felt the contact like an electric shock. Adelaide, I did not plan for this to happen. I thought I was content alone. But having you here has changed everything. I look forward to meals because you will be there. I work harder because I want to build something worthy of you. I lie awake at night thinking about you just a few yards away, and I have to remind myself that you are here to work, that I have no right to want more. What if I want more too? Adelaide asked, her voice barely audible. Xavier's grip on her hand tightened. Do you? Instead of answering with words, Adelaide stood and walked around the table. Xavier straightened, his eyes never leaving her face. When she was close enough to feel the heat of his body, she reached up and placed her palm against his chest, feeling the strong, rapid beat of his heart beneath her fingers. I did not come west looking for love, she said. I came looking for freedom, for a chance to build my own life. But somewhere between the garden and the meals and the quiet evenings, I started feeling things I never expected to feel. When I look at you, Xavier, I do not see someone who took me in out of charity. I see a man who valued me when no one else did. I see someone strong and kind and good. And yes, I want more. I want everything. Xavier's hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone with devastating gentleness. You sure about this? Once we start down this road, there is no going back. I have never been more sure of anything. Xavier's control snapped. He pulled her against him, one arm wrapping around her waist while his other hand tangled in her hair. His kiss was fierce and hungry, acclaiming as much as a caress. Adelaide melted into him, her arms winding around his neck as she kissed him back with equal fervor. She had been kissed before, chased pecks from overeager suitors back in Missouri, but nothing had prepared her for this. Xavier kissed like he did everything else, with total commitment and raw intensity. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said, the words more demand than question. Adelaide laughed, the sound shaky. That was quite possibly the least romantic proposal in history. "Then let me try again." Xavier pulled back slightly, his hands framing her face. "Adelaide Parker, you walked into my life when I had stopped believing in anything beyond work and survival. You brought light and warmth and purpose. You made me remember what it means to hope for something beyond the next day. I do not have much to offer you beyond this cabin and the land and these two hands, but I swear to you I will spend every day trying to make you happy. Will you marry me?" Adelaide felt tears spill down her cheeks, but they were tears of joy. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you, Xavier Harding." He kissed her again, softer this time but no less passionate. When they finally separated, both were grinning like fools. "We should go to town tomorrow," Xavier said. "Find the preacher, make it official." "There will be talk," Adelaide warned. "The ladies who gossiped about my lack of prospects will have a field day." Xavier's grin turned fierce. "Let them talk. Let them see that a real man does not need a dowry or fancy connections. All he needs is the right woman, and I have found mine." The next morning they rode into Winnetka together, Adelaide seated in front of Xavier on his massive bay horse. The town came alive with whispers the moment they appeared, and Adelaide held her head high, refusing to show any embarrassment. Let them stare. Let them gossip. She was going to marry the man she loved, and their opinions meant nothing. They found the preacher at his small church on the edge of town. Reverend Williams was a kindly man in his 50s who listened to their request with warm eyes. "I would be honored to perform the ceremony," he said. "Shall we say this Sunday? That will give you time to arrange for witnesses and prepare." "No," Xavier said firmly. "We want to marry today, now if possible." The preacher blinked in surprise. "Today, but there are customs, preparations." "We do not need any of that," Xavier said. "We need to be married. Everything else is just dressing." Adelaide squeezed Xavier's hand. "Today," she confirmed. "Please." Reverend Williams looked between them and must have seen something in their faces that convinced him. "Very well. Let me fetch my wife to serve as a witness, and we will proceed." 20 minutes later, Adelaide stood before the simple altar in the little church, her hand clasped in Xavier's, and spoke vows that bound her life to his. She wore her mended traveling dress, had no bouquet or veil, and there was no one present but the preacher and his wife. It was the furthest thing from the grand wedding she had once imagined as a girl, but as she looked into Xavier's eyes and heard him promise to love and cherish her for the rest of his days, she knew it was perfect. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Xavier kissed her with such tenderness that Adelaide felt her heart might burst. They were married. She was Mrs. Xavier Harding now, and the joy of it was almost overwhelming. As they left the church, they nearly collided with Mrs. Cassidy and her friend, the two women who had so thoroughly dissected Adelaide's prospects weeks before. Both women stopped dead, staring at the newlyweds in shock. "Miss Parker," Mrs. Cassidy gasped. "What is this?" Mrs. Harding now, Xavier corrected, his arm possessive around Adelaide's waist. "We just married." The women's jaws dropped in perfect unison. Mrs. Cassidy recovered first, her expression shifting from shock to something calculating. "How? Unexpected. Mr. Harding, I was not aware you were acquainted with Miss Parker." "Adelaide has been working at my homestead for the past 3 weeks," Xavier said calmly, "and I decided I could not live without her, so we married." But she has got no dowry," the other woman sputtered as if this were a crime against nature itself. Xavier's expression hardened. "She has got herself, and that is more than enough. In fact, that is everything. Now, if you will excuse us, ladies, my wife and I have a home to return to." He guided Adelaide past the gaping women, and once they were out of earshot, Adelaide dissolved into giggles. "Did you see their faces?" "Worth every second," Xavier said with satisfaction, "though I expect the story will be all over town by evening." "Let them talk," Adelaide said, echoing his words from the night before. "I do not care what they think." "That is my wife," Xavier said proudly, and Adelaide felt warmth flood through her at the word. Wife. She was Xavier's wife. They stopped at the general store to purchase supplies, and the merchant's eyes widened when Xavier introduced Adelaide as Mrs. Harding. Word was already spreading, it seemed. But Xavier conducted their business with calm efficiency, paying for flour, sugar, coffee, and various other necessities without any trace of embarrassment. As they loaded the supplies onto the horse, a young woman approached hesitantly. She was perhaps a year or two younger than Adelaide, with tired eyes and a shabby dress. "Excuse me," she said softly. "Are you truly the woman who had no dowry?" Adelaide hesitated, then nodded. "I am." The young woman's eyes filled with hope. "And he married you anyway?" "Even knowing you had nothing." "She had everything that mattered," Xavier interjected firmly. The young woman looked at Adelaide with something like wonder. "I am in the same situation. My parents are gone, and I have been staying with an aunt who says I must marry her choice or leave her home. I thought I had no options, but seeing you gives me hope. If you could find someone who valued you for yourself, perhaps I can too." Adelaide felt her heart squeeze with sympathy. She remembered all too well that feeling of being trapped, of having no choices. She reached out and squeezed the young woman's hand. "Do not settle for less than you deserve," she said. "Do not let desperation force you into a situation you cannot escape. There are good men in this world, men who will see your worth. I promise you that." The young woman blinked back tears. "Thank you. Thank you for showing me it is possible." As she hurried away, Adelaide turned to find Xavier watching her with an expression of such tenderness it made her knees weak. "What?" she asked. "You gave her hope. You showed her that the gossips and the judgmental fools do not get the final say." He pulled her close, unmindful of the people passing on the street. "You are remarkable, Adelaide Harding. We are remarkable," she corrected. "You were the one who saw past all the nonsense about dowries and prospects." "Because it is nonsense," Xavier said. "A woman's worth has nothing to do with what she brings in material goods. It has everything to do with who she is as a person." They rode home in the golden afternoon light, Adelaide wrapped in Xavier's arms, feeling happier than she had ever been. Her new life was beginning, and it was more than she had ever dared to dream. The summer passed in a haze of happiness. Adelaide settled into her role as Xavier's wife with ease, finding joy in the daily rhythms of their life together. She maintained the garden, now flourishing under her care, and learned to preserve the vegetables for winter. Xavier taught her to shoot, standing behind her to steady her aim, his patient instruction interspersed with stolen kisses. They worked side by side on various projects, building a chicken coop, expanding the barn, and creating a root cellar for storage. But it was the nights that Adelaide treasured most. After the work was done and supper cleared away, they would sit together on the porch Xavier had built, watching the sun set over the mountains. Xavier would tell her stories of his travels, of the wild places he had seen and the people he had met. Adelaide would share memories of her childhood. The good times before her mother's death had cast a shadow over everything. And later, in the privacy of their cabin, Xavier would take her in his arms and show her with touch and whisper what words could never fully express. He was a gentle lover despite his size and strength, always careful with her, always attuned to her responses. Adelaide discovered a passionate side of herself she had never known existed, a hunger that matched Xavier's own. They would come together in the flickering firelight, skin against skin, and Adelaide would feel complete in a way she had never imagined possible. By August, Adelaide realized she had not bled in 2 months. At first, she attributed it to the change in her circumstances, the physical demands of her new life. But when morning nausea began to plague her, she could no longer deny the truth. She was carrying Xavier's child. She told him one evening after supper, nervous despite knowing he would be pleased. Xavier's reaction did not disappoint. His face lit up with such pure joy that Adelaide felt tears spring to her eyes. He swept her into his arms, lifting her clear off the ground despite her protests, and spun her around with a whoop of delight. "Careful," she laughed. "You will make me dizzy." "A baby," Xavier said, setting her down but keeping his arms around her. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Adelaide asked, though his expression made the answer obvious. "Happy does not begin to cover it," Xavier said. He placed his large hand gently on her still flat stomach. "A child, our child. Adelaide, you have made me the happiest man in California." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, though the nausea persisted for several more weeks. Xavier became impossibly protective, insisting that Adelaide rest more and take on fewer physical tasks. She protested that she was not fragile, but secretly she was touched by his concern. He would place his hand on her growing belly each night, marveling at the changes, and talk to the baby about the world waiting outside. As autumn arrived, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Adelaide began to prepare for the baby's arrival. She sewed tiny clothes from fabric Xavier purchased on trips to town, her needle creating delicate garments for the child she had not yet met. Xavier carved a beautiful cradle from pine, working on it in the evenings with the same focused intensity he brought to all his projects. Word of Adelaide's pregnancy had spread through town, and to her surprise, several women from Winnetka made the trip up to the homestead to visit. Some came out of genuine kindness, bringing gifts and advice. Others came out of curiosity, wanting to see for themselves how the girl with no dowry was faring in her mountain marriage. Mrs. Cassidy was among the latter group. She arrived one crisp October afternoon, her expression a mixture of condescension and reluctant respect. "Mrs. Harding," she said, accepting the tea Adelaide offered, "you are looking well. Marriage clearly agrees with you." "It does," Adelaide said simply. "I am very happy." "Yes, well, Mrs." Cassidy shifted in her seat. "I must admit, I did not expect things to turn out as they have. When you first arrived in Winnetka, I thought. That is, many of us thought you would struggle to find your place." "You thought I would fail," Adelaide said bluntly. "Because I had no dowry, no connections, nothing to recommend me but myself." Mrs. Cassidy had the grace to look embarrassed. "Perhaps we were too quick to judge. Your husband clearly values you highly." "Xavier values me because he sees beyond the superficial," Adelaide said. "He understood something that many people do not. A person's worth is not measured in material possessions. I may have arrived here with nothing in my pockets, but I had myself. My strength, my determination, my capacity for hard work and love. That was enough for Xavier, and that is why we are happy." The older woman was quiet for a moment, seeming to truly consider Adelaide's words. "You have given hope to other young women in difficult circumstances," she said finally. "The girl you spoke to in town, the one whose aunt was pressuring her to marry. She found work at the hotel and is saving money to start her own business. She says you inspired her to believe in other possibilities." Adelaide felt a warm glow of satisfaction. "I am glad. No woman should feel she must accept less than she deserves simply because her circumstances are difficult." After Mrs. Cassidy left, Xavier came in from his work and found Adelaide standing by the window, one hand on her rounded belly. What did the old busybody want? He asked, coming to stand behind her and wrapping his arms around her. To satisfy her curiosity, mostly, but also, I think, to admit she was wrong about me. Adelaide leaned back against Xavier's solid warmth. She said, "I have given hope to other women." "You give me hope every day," Xavier murmured against her hair. "Hope for our future, for our family, for all the years we will have together." Adelaide turned in his arms, tilting her face up for a kiss. "I love you, Xavier Harding. I loved you from that first day, I think, when you took me in without question or judgment." "I loved you from that moment too," Xavier admitted. "I saw you standing in my clearing, dirty and exhausted but still fighting, and I thought, there is a woman worth knowing. I did not expect to love you. I did not expect you to become the center of my whole world. But you did, Adelaide. You are everything to me." They stood together in the fading light, wrapped in each other's arms, two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed. Winter arrived early that year, bringing heavy snows to the mountains. Adelaide's belly grew round and full, and Xavier fussed over her constantly, making sure she stayed warm and well fed. He had stocked the cabin with enough supplies to last them through even the harshest winter, and the woodpile he had built was massive, ensuring they would never lack for heat. In late January, on a night when the snow fell thick and silent outside, Adelaide's labor began. Xavier, for all his strength and competence, was clearly terrified. He had faced down bears and survived brutal mountain winters, but the thought of Adelaide in pain undid him completely. "I should ride for the doctor," he said for the 10th time, pacing like a caged animal. "You will do no such thing," Adelaide said firmly, breathing through a contraction. "The roads are impassable, and I will not have you freezing to death on my account. Women have been birthing babies for thousands of years without doctors. We will manage. But what if something goes wrong?" Adelaide caught his hand, forcing him to look at her. "Then we will handle it together. But Xavier, I need you here with me, not panicking. Can you do that?" He took a deep breath, visibly wrestling his fear under control. "Yes, yes, I can do that. Tell me what you need." The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next morning. Adelaide drew on reserves of strength she had not known she possessed, while Xavier stayed by her side every moment, offering water and words of encouragement, his hand a lifeline in hers. When she was sure she could not endure another moment, when she was ready to give up entirely, Xavier leaned close and whispered fiercely in her ear, "You are the strongest person I have ever known. You walked away from everything you knew to build a new life. You made a home in the wilderness. You can do this, Adelaide. You can do anything." His words gave her the strength she needed for that final push, and suddenly the cabin was filled with the thin, indignant wail of a newborn. Xavier caught the baby with shaking hands, and Adelaide watched through tears as her husband carefully cleaned their child and wrapped the tiny body in soft cloth. "A boy," Xavier said, his voice choked with emotion. "We have a son, Adelaide." He placed the baby in her arms, and Adelaide looked down at the tiny, perfect face. Her son had Xavier's dark hair and a red, wrinkled face that would have been funny if it had not been so impossibly dear. She traced a finger over one miniature hand, marveling as tiny fingers closed around hers. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "We have been waiting for you." Xavier sat on the edge of the bed, his arm around Adelaide's shoulders, gazing at his son with wonder. What should we name him? They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy, but nothing had felt quite right. Now, looking at her son's face, Adelaide knew exactly what his name should be. "Daniel," she said. "Daniel Harding." "Daniel," Xavier repeated, testing the name. A smile spread across his face. "It is perfect. He is perfect. You are perfect." He kissed Adelaide's forehead tenderly. "Thank you for this gift. Thank you for him, for us, for everything." Adelaide leaned against her husband's strength, her son cradled between them, and felt a peace so profound it was almost overwhelming. This was her family. This was her home. Everything she had endured, every hardship and struggle, had led her to this moment. And it had all been worth it. The years that followed were full and rich. Daniel grew from a tiny baby into a sturdy boy with his father's strength and his mother's determination. Adelaide had 2 more children, a girl they named Emma when Daniel was 3, and another boy, Thomas, 2 years after that. The cabin Xavier had built expanded with their growing family, gaining additional rooms and a larger porch where the children could play. Xavier proved to be a devoted father, patient and loving with his children while still maintaining the protective strength that had first drawn Adelaide to him. He taught Daniel to track and hunt, to read the forest and respect the wilderness. He was gentle with Emma, encouraging her curiosity and teaching her that she could do anything her brothers could do. And with Thomas, the baby who looked most like Adelaide with his green eyes and auburn hair, Xavier was tender and attentive. Adelaide's days were busy with the work of raising 3 children and maintaining their homestead, but she loved every moment of it. She had expanded the garden to feed their growing family, and had even begun selling her preserved vegetables and jams in town, earning money that helped supplement Xavier's income from hunting and the occasional jobs he took with other settlers. The town's attitude toward Adelaide had shifted dramatically over the years. The woman who had once been dismissed as having nothing to offer was now respected as one of the hardest working, most capable women in the community. Young women in difficult circumstances sought her out for advice, and Adelaide always made time for them, remembering her own desperation and fear. On a warm spring evening when Daniel was 7, Emma 4, and Thomas 2, Adelaide stood in the doorway of their cabin watching Xavier play with the children in the yard. He had Daniel and Emma chasing him while Thomas rode on his shoulders, shrieking with laughter. The sight filled her with such love and contentment that she had to blink back tears. Xavier looked up and caught her watching. He said something to the children that sent them running off toward the creek, then walked over to where she stood. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, pulling her into his arms. "I am thinking about how different my life might have been," Adelaide said. "If I had not run from Missouri, if I had not walked up that mountain trail, if you had not been there chopping wood in your clearing." "Fate," Xavier said. "It had to be. 2 people who needed each other, finding each other at exactly the right moment." "The town ladies thought I had nothing to offer," Adelaide said, smiling at the memory of those painful days. "No dowry, no prospects, no value. They were blind," Xavier said fiercely. "You had everything. You had courage and strength and kindness. You had a spirit that refused to be broken. You had yourself, Adelaide, and that was more than enough. That was everything." Adelaide reached up and cupped his face in her hands. You saw me when no one else would. You valued me when the world had written me off. You loved me not for what I could bring you, but for who I was. And I have loved you every day since, Xavier said. When I wake up next to you, when I watch you with our children, when I see how you have made this rough place into a real home, I fall in love with you all over again. They kissed as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Their children's laughter echoed from the creek, a sound that had become the soundtrack of their lives. Adelaide thought about the woman she had been, arriving in Winnetka with $3 and a heart full of fear. That woman seemed like someone from another lifetime. She had found something in the California mountains that she had never expected to find. A home, a family, and a love that had transformed her entire world. She had learned that her worth was not determined by what she owned or what she could offer a potential husband, but by who she was as a person. And she had found a man who understood that truth and loved her for it. As the years continued to pass, Adelaide and Xavier's homestead became a gathering place for the community. Other families settled in the area, drawn by the promise of good land and the knowledge that the Hardings were generous neighbors. Xavier helped new settlers build their cabins and taught them the skills they needed to survive in the mountains. Adelaide shared her knowledge of gardening and preserving, and always made sure that any woman who arrived alone or in difficult circumstances knew she had a friend. Daniel grew into a strong, capable young man, much like his father. He was tall and broad-shouldered by 15, with Xavier's skill in the wilderness and Adelaide's quick mind. Emma became a force of nature, refusing to let her gender limit her in any way. She could shoot as well as her brothers, ride as fearlessly, and debate as fiercely. Thomas, the youngest, inherited his mother's gentle nature and his father's strength, a combination that made him beloved by everyone who knew him. On Adelaide's 35th birthday, the entire community gathered at the Harding homestead for a celebration. Tables were set up in the yard, groaning with food that neighbors had contributed. Children ran wild through the clearing while adults talked and laughed. It was a far cry from the lonely birthdays Adelaide had spent in Missouri, and she found herself overwhelmed with gratitude for the life she had built. Mrs. Cassidy, now quite elderly, approached Adelaide as the sun began to set. The old woman moved slowly, leaning on a cane, but her eyes were still sharp. "Mrs. Harding," she said, "I wanted a word with you if you have a moment." Adelaide gestured to a quiet corner of the porch, and they sat together watching the festivities. "I have been thinking about the day you arrived in Winnetka," Mrs. Cassidy said without preamble. "About the things I said, the judgments I made. I was wrong about you, Adelaide, profoundly wrong." "You are not alone in that," Adelaide said gently. "Many people made the same mistake. But I should have known better. I should have seen your character, your strength. Instead, I saw only your circumstances and assumed they defined you." The old woman shook her head. "You have built something remarkable here. A family, a home, a community, and you did it all starting from nothing." "Not nothing," Adelaide corrected. "I had myself. That was always enough." Mrs. Cassidy smiled. "That is precisely the lesson I should have learned years ago. I have watched you help so many young women who arrived in circumstances similar to yours. You have shown them that their worth is not measured in dowries or connections, but in who they are as people. That is a powerful gift, Adelaide." "It is a gift Xavier gave me first," Adelaide said, looking across the yard to where her husband was teaching Thomas how to throw an axe. "He saw me when I felt invisible. He valued me when everyone else had written me off. He taught me that I was enough exactly as I was. I am just passing that lesson on." The old woman reached out and patted Adelaide's hand. "You chose well when you married him, or perhaps he chose well. Either way, you two have built something that will last long after we are all gone. Your children will pass on these lessons, and their children after them. That is a legacy worth more than all the dowries in the world." As Mrs. Cassidy moved away, Xavier came to sit beside Adelaide. He smelled of wood smoke and pine, familiar and comforting. "What was that about?" he asked, nodding toward the retreating figure. "She was apologizing for judging me all those years ago," Adelaide said, "and acknowledging that she was wrong." Xavier snorted. "Took her long enough." "Better late than never." Adelaide leaned against his shoulder. "Look at all this, Xavier. All these people, this community, we helped build this." "You helped build this," Xavier corrected. "I just chopped the wood and hammered the nails. You created the heart of it, Adelaide. You made people feel welcome. You helped those who needed it. You showed everyone what real strength looks like." Adelaide turned to look at her husband, seeing the threads of silver beginning to appear in his long, dark hair, the lines around his eyes that came from years of smiling. He was still the most handsome man she had ever seen, still the person who made her heart race with just a look. "I love you," she said simply. "I have loved you since the day you told me I was enough, exactly as I was, and I will love you until the day I die." Xavier pulled her close, his kiss tender and sweet. "And I will love you beyond that," he murmured against her lips. "Into whatever comes after, Adelaide. You are woven into my soul. There is no me without you anymore." Their children found them sitting together on the porch as the stars began to appear overhead. Daniel sat on one side, Emma on the other, and Thomas climbed into Xavier's lap, despite being nearly too big for it. They sat together as a family, watching the community they had helped build celebrate under the mountain sky. Adelaide felt Xavier's hand find hers, their fingers interlacing in a gesture that had become second nature over the years. She squeezed back, a silent communication of love and gratitude that needed no words. This was her life, the one she had built from nothing but courage and determination. It was better than anything she could have imagined in those dark days before she fled Missouri. She had proven the doubters wrong, but more importantly, she had proven to herself that she had value beyond what society dictated. She was enough. She had always been enough, and she had found a man who not only saw that truth but celebrated it every single day. As the party wound down and neighbors began to drift away to their own homesteads, Adelaide helped clean up while Xavier settled the younger children into bed. Daniel, no longer needing such attention, stood beside his mother washing dishes. "Mama," he said suddenly, "can I ask you something?" "Of course, sweetheart. Some of the boys in town, they talk about marriage, about how a girl needs to have money or land or something to offer. But that is not how you and Pa got married, is it?" Adelaide set down the plate she had been drying and turned to face her son. "No, it is not. When I met your father, I had nothing but myself, and he loved me anyway. He loved me because of who I was, not what I owned." Daniel nodded slowly. "That is how I want to be, like Pa, someone who sees what really matters." Adelaide felt tears prick her eyes. She pulled her son into a hug, marveling at how tall he had grown, how much he resembled his father. "You already are, Daniel. You have your father's best qualities and more. Someday you will find someone who deserves your love, and you will value them for who they are, not what they can bring you. That is the kind of man your father raised you to be." Later, when the cabin was quiet and all three children were asleep, Adelaide and Xavier sat together on their bed. Xavier was braiding Adelaide's hair, a nightly ritual he had claimed early in their marriage and never abandoned. His large fingers were surprisingly deft as they wove the strands together. "I overheard you talking to Daniel," he said quietly. about marriage and what matters. He is growing up so fast, Adelaide said. It will not be long before he is thinking seriously about courting someone. He will choose well. We raised him to see what is important. Xavier finished the braid and wrapped his arms around Adelaide from behind, pulling her back against his chest. Do you ever regret it? The life you could have had if you had stayed in Missouri? If you had accepted your uncle's arrangement? Never, Adelaide said without hesitation. That was not a life, Xavier. That was a cage. This, here with you and our children, this is living. This is everything I ever wanted, even when I did not know I wanted it. Xavier kissed the top of her head. I think about the day you walked into my clearing. You looked so fierce, so determined. I was drawn to you immediately, but I was also terrified. Adelaide twisted to look at him in surprise. Terrified of what? Of how much I wanted you, of how quickly I could see myself falling for you. I had been alone for so long, Adelaide. I had convinced myself I did not need anyone, that I was content with my solitary life. And then you appeared, and within days you had turned my world upside down. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. I felt the same way, Adelaide admitted. You were this force of nature, this impossibly strong, capable man who treated me with more respect and kindness than anyone ever had. I fell in love with you so fast it scared me. I kept thinking you would wake up one day and realize you had made a mistake taking me in. Never, Xavier said fiercely. You were never a mistake. You were the best thing that ever happened to me. You still are. They lay down together, Adelaide tucked securely in Xavier's arms, her head on his chest where she could hear the steady beat of his heart. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, and somewhere an owl called to its mate. Adelaide felt utterly content, utterly safe, utterly loved. Thank you, she whispered into the darkness. For what? For seeing me, for valuing me, for teaching me that I was enough. She tilted her head up to kiss his jaw. You gave me everything, Xavier. Not material things, though we have built a good life. You gave me belief in myself. You gave me love without conditions. You gave me a home and a family. You gave me everything that matters. Xavier tightened his arms around her. You gave me the same, Adelaide. You brought light into my darkness. You gave me purpose and hope and a reason to build something beyond simple survival. We gave those things to each other. That is what love is. Adelaide closed her eyes, letting Xavier's warmth and the rhythm of his breathing lull her toward sleep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new moments to share. But tonight, she was simply grateful. Grateful for the courage that had brought her west. Grateful for the mountain man who had seen past her lack of dowry to the woman beneath. Grateful for the life they had built together, brick by brick, day by day. She had arrived in California with nothing but herself, and Xavier had shown her that was more than enough. It was everything. And from that truth, they had built a love that would last all their days and echo through generations yet to come. The woman who had been dismissed as having no prospects had created something the doubters could never have imagined. She had created a legacy of love, strength, and the unshakable belief that every person has worth simply by being who they are. It was a lesson she would teach her children, who would teach their children, ensuring that the mountain man's wisdom would live on long after he was gone. But that was far in the future. Tonight, Adelaide Harding slept peacefully in her husband's arms, surrounded by the family and home they had built together. And in her dreams, she walked again up that mountain trail, young and desperate and scared, not knowing that she was walking toward the greatest love story of her life. A love story that proved once and for all that the only dowry worth having is the courage to be yourself, and the wisdom to recognize that in another. Years continued to roll by like the seasons, each one bringing its own challenges and triumphs. Daniel eventually fell in love with a spirited young woman named Sarah who had arrived in the territory with her family. Adelaide watched with pride as her son courted Sarah with the same respect and genuine affection that Xavier had shown her. When Daniel asked for Sarah's hand, he never once inquired about what she could bring to the marriage. He loved her for who she was, just as he had been taught. Emma, true to her independent nature, announced at 19 that she had no immediate plans to marry. She wanted to learn everything she could about medicine and healing, inspired by the traveling doctor who occasionally visited their community. Xavier and Adelaide supported her ambitions, much to the shock of some more traditional families. But they had never been traditional, and they saw no reason their daughter should be limited by gender. Thomas, their gentle youngest, became a teacher, gathering the settlement children in the Harding cabin during winter months to teach them reading, writing, and arithmetic. He had inherited Adelaide's love of learning and Xavier's patience, a combination that made him a natural educator. On Adelaide's 45th birthday, Xavier took her on a ride to the spot where they had first met. The clearing looked much the same, though time had weathered the cabin and filled in some of the spaces with new growth. They stood together in the place where their story had begun, Xavier's arm around Adelaide's waist. 23 years, Xavier said softly. 23 years since you walked into this clearing and changed my life forever. Adelaide leaned into him, marveling at how his strength had never diminished despite the silver now liberally threading his hair. Best decision I ever made, getting lost and following the sound of your axe. You were never lost, Xavier said. You were finding your way home. You just did not know it yet. They had carved a good life from the California wilderness, had raised 3 remarkable children, and had built a community based on respect and mutual support. But more than any of that, they had proven something that Adelaide held dear, that a person's worth is not measured in material possessions or social connections, but in the content of their character. As they rode back toward their homestead, where their children and grandchildren were gathering for the birthday celebration, Adelaide reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She had fled Missouri with nothing, had been written off by society as having no value, no prospects, no future. But she had possessed something far more important than a dowry. She had possessed herself, her strength, her determination, her capacity for love and hard work. And she had found a man who recognized that truth, who saw her worth when no one else would, who loved her not for what she could bring him but for who she was. Together, they had built something that would last far beyond their own lifetimes, a legacy of love and acceptance that would ripple through generations. The sun was setting as they arrived home, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Their family spilled out of the cabin to greet them, Daniel's children running to hug their grandparents, Emma waving from the porch where she was helping Thomas set up tables. It was chaos and noise and love, everything Adelaide had never known she wanted until she had it. Xavier helped her down from the horse, his hands strong and sure, and Adelaide looked up at the man who had been her partner, lover, and best friend for more than 2 decades. His face was weathered by sun and time, but his eyes held the same fierce love they had held the day he first kissed her. "Happy?" he asked, though he surely knew the answer. "Happier than I ever dreamed possible," Adelaide said. "You gave me everything, Xavier, everything that matters." "You gave me the same," he said, pulling her close for a kiss that still made her heart race after all these years. "And I would do it all again in a heartbeat. Every moment, every challenge, every joy, all of it, as long as it was with you." They walked hand in hand toward their family, toward the home they had built together, toward the future that stretched bright and full before them. Adelaide Parker Harding, the woman who had been told she had nothing to offer, had proven them all wrong. She had offered everything that mattered, herself, fully and completely. And that had been more than enough. It had been everything. And from that truth, from that simple, powerful truth, she and Xavier had built a love that would endure through all the days of their lives and echo in the hearts of their children and grandchildren for generations to come. The mountain man had been right all along. She had got herself, and that had been enough. That had been everything. And together, they had built a life that proved love and worth had nothing to do with dowries or social standing, and everything to do with seeing and valuing the person beneath. It was a lesson Adelaide would carry to her last breath, and one she had passed on to everyone whose life she touched. As the stars began to appear overhead, and their family gathered around the table Xavier had built with his own hands, Adelaide sent up a silent prayer of gratitude. For the courage that had brought her west, for the mountain man who had seen her worth, for the children who carried their legacy forward, for every moment of joy and struggle that had brought her to this perfect evening, surrounded by love. She had walked away from everything she knew with nothing but hope and determination. And she had found, in the wilds of California, in the arms of a mountain man who valued what truly mattered, everything she had ever needed. Her story was not one of riches or social triumph, but something far more valuable. It was a story of love that saw past the superficial to the soul beneath. It was a story of worth recognized and celebrated. It was a story of two people who found in each other exactly what they needed, and built from that foundation a life of meaning and joy. And as Xavier raised his glass to toast Adelaide, his eyes shining with love and pride, she knew that no dowry in the world could have bought what they had. Because what they had was priceless. Genuine love built on respect and recognition of each other's true worth. It was everything. It had always been everything. And it would be enough to carry them through whatever days remained, together until the very end, just as they had promised all those years ago in a small church in Winnetka, when a mountain man had claimed his bride and told the world that she was enough, more than enough. She was everything.